Let's come back. We're at 2014, very late, October 11th. We are heading into 2015, which is an epical year. The traction of a new scalar of civilization will receive in 2015 great confirmation, both from the pivot and from the farthest limits of actual exploration. The farthest limits, that mission is called New Horizons, appropriately. And New Horizons will come into play with Pluto as the farthest planet that we will have sent our technological inquiry and instruments to. Pluto and its large moon Charon and 4 smaller moons. Pluto with Charon is actually almost a double planet. It is 3 billion miles away. To give you an idea, Saturn is only 1 billion miles away. The second is that later in 2015, towards the summer, not just the early months of like January, February, the second probe called Dawn in the asteroid belt, which already surveyed the giant asteroid Vesta, will have come to the largest asteroid in the asteroid belt, Ceres. Like Pluto as a dwarf planet, Ceres can be classified as a dwarf planet. It is spherical. It has an impenetrable envelope of atmosphere, and all of this will give us the pivot at the center of our star system, of the solar system, and the farthest reach of dwarf planets. It's that asteroid belt after the 4 rocky inner planets, and the dwarf planet twin Pluto-Charon is the first of the Kuiper belt of many more and much larger than asteroids, of which already we have discovered one of the new Kuiper belt objects, Eris, originally named Xenia for a female hero in the television and cartoon era, is larger than Pluto. And many other large Kuiper belt objects. And just as the asteroid belt has thousands of asteroids, the Kuiper belt has hundreds of thousands of items. And way beyond that, almost to the stretches of star system imagination, is a great sphere called the Oort cloud, named for Jan Oort, like the Kuiper belt is named for Gerhard Kuiper, who was Dutch and then spent his time at the University of Chicago. The Oort cloud has millions of objects that occasionally receive a gravitational perturbation from interstellar qualities, passing waves of gravity, and items from the Oort cloud become comets. So that the recent expedition that just got to one of the comets, the European Rosetta Stone asteroid, is able to now give us an even more detailed version The comets already have been contacted by, for instance, the Japanese Astronomical Association, JAPA. So that we have now a fertile cusp happening from this moment in 2014 into the middle of 2015. And all of this will have an accumulated resonance so that the second half of 2015 leading into 2016 is one of the great watershed resonance dates in an emerging new quality of civilization. Heralding 2017 as an epochal year by which the preparation of centuries will have come to a very active fruition. Not yet a full maturity, that is yet to come. But it will be active enough in an in-depth, largest way that the time dynamic will be understood and the space dimensions will be understood in such a way as to distill all of the transformations that have happened up until then, up until now. So that the time forms of civilization that we are exploring now in the Parayana, that were first mooted 6 years ago in the paired phase transforms, 1 year condensation of the 2-year learning civilization program, sort of a graduate level of the learning civilization. Now the Parayana is a postgraduate level. Takes us into a postdoctorate level, to a quality of being able to appreciate that what we have been living with, living through, is not only comprehensible, it's encompassing. Encompassing of a distillation that gives us an ability that was not apparent before, though was present in a few individuals, in a few groups, constantly building. And one of the qualities of challenge that we are now in the Parayana able to recognize is that this huge carrier wave, as a time form of civilization, has a reference preparation, a reference wave, leading us by about 350 years. But that the pivotal middle of a 2,000 period of carrier wave cycles, the middle of which is a millennium. And that just as carrier waves have a reference wave, reference waves themselves have a referential beginning as well for millennia. So a millennial reference wave is very powerful in terms of power, whereas the reference wave for a carrier wave is very deep in wisdom. And eventually, with maturity, one is able to balance the wisdom with the power. But initially, because of there not being a capacity to learn in a more comprehensive, encompassing scalar of consciousness, the dimensions of science are not fully understood, in their analytic, the dimension of history, which is a process, complex process that develops science into its analytic capacities, is largely distorted and reflects back upon those who are making history, the art of person making. The distortion of the historical circumstances begins to have a recursive effect on the ill preparation, not to say the damaging, not to say the injuring, not to say the killing of the art of persons and the persons themselves, but obviates the whole visionary field out of which that ecology of consciousness actually occurs, really sustains, and one collapses back into a symbolic structure that no longer has either the faith, confident hope, or charity of patience to deal with what is seen as an openness that is really nothing. An art of person making that was biased, a history that was completely manufactured, and a science which is bogus. And the collapse goes further back so that one then has the origins of the structure of symbolic thought itself mitigated more and more by the individual in their individual quality and their collection of individuals as a power group, because its reference wave is no longer the reference wave of wisdom, but is the reference wave of power. The classical case is to look at the last time there was a carrier wave, 2,000 years ago. And that carrier wave had a reference wave of about 350 BC, which is the birth of Alexander the Great, but also just a couple of years after the passing away of Plato at the age of 80 in 347 BC. So you have the maturity of Plato and the birth of Alexander the Great in that Greek ethos, which actually has many extensions throughout the world. It has an extension that goes back, for instance, in China. 350 BC in China is a tremendous pair of culminations of what was a tuned pair of Renaissance figures, Lao Tzu and Confucius, not as a split of this and that, but as a tunable pair. And the musical composition that came out of the tunable pair of Confucius and Lao Tzu was an increased resonant harmonic of the I Ching. Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, devoted to the Tao Te, the nature coming into phenomenal actuality. One of the translations that the old British Empire great translator Arthur Willey used was the way and its power. Te being not power, but being the capacity to have existence. Confucius, looking at Lao Tzu, had tuned the Tao Te, and he took as his pair, as a further of that tuning fork, the Gen E, the Gen of the human-hearted reconciliation of the Tao te that could be seen as a pair, not as a duality, but that the gen was the way to tune with that tunability, and that the E, the symbols, that the I Ching became known as the I Ching, the book of symbols. And Confucius wrote 10 commentaries that were so apt about the heretofore I Ching, the heavenly reference I Ching became the human reference I Ching in Confucius, and he wrote 10 commentaries that were so apt they were called the wings of the I Ching. And so ever after that, increasingly, the appreciation of the I Ching was not only Tao Te, but Gen E as well. And that whole ecology became moot about 350 BC, in that the Confucian who began to understand that Gen E in that larger, deeper harmonic was Mencius, Mengzi. There was a great English language commentary from the 1920s, early 1930s on Mencius by I.A. Richards, called Mencius, the multiple definitions of a new mind. And it was I.A. Richards who wrote that because he was teaming up with another genius at the time, C.K. Ogden. They did a book together called The Meaning of Meaning, which we use in the Learning Civilization. But to express that in a language learnable way commensurate with the way in which the original textbook was designed by Comenius, the Orbis Pictus, the world in pictures. They were writing a book called Basic English that began the same way that Comenius began with. What is this in English? What is this in English? What are these things in English in pictures, in images, so that one could have a way of learning a major language like English through Comenius's work distilled into what they call Basic English. And I.A. Richards was the one who wrote the little book. The first edition of the book was one of the earliest of the paperback books called pocket books. Next week I'll bring the pocketbook edition of Basic English. And C.K. Ogden wrote the larger philosophic work on it called Basic English. I'll bring that as well. Confucius, transformed by Mencius, was at the same time that Lao Tzu was transformed by Chuang Tzu. And so Mencius and Chuang Tzu, about 350 BC, bring the Renaissance figures of Confucius and Lao Tzu into play in a new way, so that some 350 years later, you had the explosion of a new quality that was dwarfing the previous power structures. And you see in the great Han dynasty of that carrier wave, there's a whiteout of Han power. The Han dynasty are called the Chinese Romans. But there's a former Han, and then there's a later Han. And in between, there's a period where it blanks out, it whites out, because they lost power across the board, and it was only painstakingly reestablished, and that's exactly at the time of 0 BC 1 AD, with several years on both sides. for Alexander the Great to be the reference wave of the previous carrier wave of 0 BC. The millennium of that was 1350, 1,000 years before the carrier wave. The year 1000 is the appearance of literate, poetic Hebrew with King David's Psalms, with King Solomon's Proverbs. But there is a reference wave of the millennium, which goes back 350 years to 1350 BC. And that reference wave is Moses and Ramesses the Pharaoh, the greatest builder of all the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. So that you have a pharaonic imperial power, a law that goes back and establishes a certain lineage of a patriarchy from the origins of man, the first man, Adam, through to Moses and his Torah. Not the complete Old Testament, the first 5 books. But the first 5 books were not 5 books by Moses. The later books, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all of this was later. It's Genesis as the main epic. It's Exodus as the outcome of that epic, now with the establishment of a new emergence that goes back and is a recovery of what had been lost before, what had been lost from 400 years of slavery in Egypt that didn't, as later Alexandrian Jews put it, it was a period of slavery in which the Egyptians and almost nobody understood Joseph. Joseph is the great-grandson of Abraham, who saved Egypt from catastrophe and famine, a Jew. Abraham, who received the quality of welcome first by Egypt, and the allotment of great wealth in terms of animals and so forth, by what turned out to be a subterfuge. He said his wife Sarai was his sister, and she was a half-sister to him. So it was a half-truth. And Pharaoh included Sarai into his entourage, and when he discovered that she really was the wife of Abraham, a very special wife, that he was transgressing a visionary love and life in that pair, he made the best amends that he could. He gave wealth and payment, animals and payment to Abraham for the transgression, and allowed him to go back to his promised land, now equipped to really inhabit that promised land. So that Moses, as a reference wave of power, is a reference wave that makes a Torah, an encoding of this patriarchal lineage that from Abraham restored now, when she became pregnant and gave birth, Sarai became Sarah. So that the Adam and Eve pair now is Abraham and Sarah pair, and their son, Isaac, becomes the inheritor of that patriarchy. With the proviso, he was given the patriarchy on the surface by his father, Abraham, but he inherited the capacity for that patriarchy from his mother. So his mother insisted that his wife be taken from the same origin as she was, as Abraham was, and that was Isaac had to send for a wife from those northern Semitic Jews that had moved from Ur, the Ur of the Chaldeans, to northern Iraq, southern Turkey today, to Haran. And it was there that Rebekah was found and brought back. And Rebekah also then made the proviso to Jacob that her prize son out of a twin, Ephraim and Jacob, she passed the blessing of Isaac on to Jacob, who then went himself to get a wife in Haran. And in fact, through duplicity there, had to receive two wives, Leah and Rachel, who was his choice. But also two more handmaidens. Abraham had had a son by his Egyptian handmaiden Hagar, and so it was a part and parcel of this quality where Jacob inherited not just the two wives, the sisters, but their ladies, so that he would have children by those four, as Abraham had had not only his wife Sarah and the Egyptian handmaiden Hagar, he had another wife, not a handmaiden, but a second wife, Ketubah, and he had 6 sons by her. Those 6 sons and the son Ishmael by Hagar were the formations then of a whole branch of Abrahamic peoples, much larger than the patriarchal branch in terms of numbers, in terms of spread, and they are the original matrix out of which Muhammad comes. And so Islam is the birth of this major inheritance, not of a patriarchy, but of the Abrahamic fertility. So that the reference wave, which is a 2,000-year period from Moses, that goes, yes, to the millennial for reference waves to Alexander the Great, but the carrier wave of that millennial reference wave goes another 1,000 years to 650 AD. And so what is carrier wave referentiality for Moses and his Torah is Muhammad and his Quran. So that you get out of that whole civilized accumulation a tremendous realization going on, and at the same time as that is going on for the birth of Islam, the reference wave occurs then for China in 650 AD. The same time as Muhammad. The great book that came out in 1902, the same year as John Dewey and Evelyn Dewey's Schools of Tomorrow, is the great Alfred J. Butler, A.J. Butler, The Arab Conquest of Egypt and the Last 30 Years of the Roman Dominion. Oxford, 1902. Alexandria was absorbed by Islam in 642 AD in our calendar. Muhammad lived until 632. Within 10 years of the death, of the ascension of Muhammad, Islam was powered enough to not only conquer Egypt, but to come into possession of Alexandria. The world is reeling from the Islamic State taking over Mosul is nothing compared to Islam taking over Alexandria. Because immediately the quality of Islam received a reference wave aeonic boost of power, and the next 30 years Islam spread by winning every single battle that they fought as fast as they could ride. It stretched from Gibraltar to the farthest regions of India. Within 40 years, one active lifetime of Muhammad, Islam became one of the largest swaths of civilization, which they took rationally, rightfully, as the sign of support. And what was that support? That the reference wave for the carrier wave of civilization that had been largely Jewish transformed into Christian was superseded by the reference wave, so that Muhammad was not only the aeonic inheritor of Moses, he was the millennial inheritor of Alexander the Great, who had envisioned his world civilization, his ecumene, as stretching from India to what we know today as the British Isles. He never got to do the western part. He died in his early 30s. But he already had contacted at the farthest reaches of the Mediterranean, and what it became today Marseille. And the greatest mariner of that age, about 340 BC, Pythias, took an expedition out through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Atlantic, up not just to the British Isles, but circumnavigated the entire skein of Britain, Ireland, and Scotland, all the way out to the Faroe Islands in the Atlantic, North Atlantic, and wrote about it. Alexander was looking to do that. Islam was moving very much to do that. By the late 600s, and just then in the early 680s, the power of Alexandrian wisdom, the Hermetic tradition, after some 500 years of sophistication, that specialized by that time in alchemy and astrology, was passed on in a peculiar way to a hermit named Morianus, who lived in the ruins of Jerusalem on the hills outside, towards where Emmaus was in Jesus' time. About a long afternoon's walk out of Jerusalem proper at the time. And his number one student was the wisdom son of the first Caliph, who made it his purpose to not just establish an empire of Islam, but to make sure that all of this was raised to the highest level that civilization could go. And he learned all of the sciences of alchemy from Morianus in the early 680s, and passed on in Arabic the quality that all of the wise wisdom people in Alexandria and Egypt and wherever the levels came to be translated into Arabic, so that by the early 700s the Arabic language became the inheritor not only of this Abrahamic origin, but of the alchemical and astrological wisdom of the Hermetic tradition. And it surfaced in the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid, the Arabian Nights territory, as the Ikhwan al-Safa, a brotherhood of idealists on the fringe of Orthodox Islam that eventually found its genius in Ibn Arabi some 500 years later. And he is the Ibn Arabi, heir to the prophets, became the greatest poet, seer, mythical astrology according to Ibn Arabi, the journey to the Lord of the Power. We use that in the learning civilization, in the complementarity, the voyage of no return, and the contemplation of the holy mysteries in 14 poetic sections, a poetic epic that's very much in the keeping with the 14-generation metronome of the Abrahamic inheritance of Jesus, now transferred and transformed. Began with visions in Mecca and ended with a glorious Damascus teaching career. More next week.